Hi everyone, so welcome to the explanation video for chapter 4 on the mind and body. As always, if you haven't read the chapter already, please go ahead and do so and then come back and look at this video. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the mind and the body, and we're going to look at it from a perspective of a very specific problem called the mind-body problem. And in a really general sense, the mind-body problem is just the issue of what mental phenomena really are and how they relate to the physical world. Okay, so you might think, look, all right, so I have a body, right? We all have these bodies, okay? And they can do things, right? So I can open and close my hand, I can talk, right? I can interact with the physical world in all sorts of ways. I can shake hands. And you might think, well, okay, so I have a body, but I also have a mind, right? So I have this thing that's thinking, and you might think that the thing that's thinking, like your mind, is actually something different from just the physical sort of stuff that you're used to seeing out in the world, right? So many people think that, sure, my body is physical, but somehow my mind isn't just a purely physical thing. It's like something else. It's some non-physical kind of thing, right? You might think it's a soul. You might think that it's just made of non-physical stuff. Okay. And the question is, it seems like, at least, even if you're not a big fan of that picture, it seems like there's this weird question of how it is our mind somehow is in connection with our bodies, right? Right? How is it that our mind is like a really complex thing, okay, that plausibly isn't even made of the same physical stuff that our bodies are made of? How is it that that mind interacts with the body? Okay. Right? It doesn't seem like our mind can be like measured really, right? We can't weigh our mind. It wouldn't make any sense to weigh our mind. We can't dissect our mind. We can maybe dissect our brain, but our brain isn't necessarily our mind. Okay. So how does this work? So what are some theories what are some of the theories that try to solve this problem? Well, there's a few that we're going to primarily look at. So one is substance dualism. I think this is a really popular one for people first coming into this. Okay. Materialism is probably also really popular as well, but we'll get to that in a second. Okay, substance dualism, that's the view that so earlier I was talking about as if the mind is, as a matter of fact, non-physical. Some people don't think that's actually the case, okay? It seems that way, at least, but some people don't think it's actually the case. For those who do think that the mind is made of some different stuff than the body, substance dualism is probably what they subscribe to. The idea is that the mind and the body are two fundamentally different kinds of things, or substances, we'll typically call them. And the mind's made of non-physical stuff, and the body is made of physical stuff, right? And this makes sense if you think there's a soul, right? You don't think that when you die that your soul necessarily dies. Your soul somehow lives on, okay? If you think souls are real, this is probably a really natural view to have, okay? You can't weigh a soul. You can't put a soul under a microscope, okay? But even if you don't think there's a soul, you might be attracted to a view that there's actually mental stuff. There's stuff that your mind's made of that isn't purely physical. Again, for reasons I talked about earlier, right? You might not think you can weigh your mind, right? Or measure your mind, okay? But you can measure like your fingers. You can weigh your brain. But doesn't mean you're weighing your mind or measuring your brain, or excuse me, measuring your mind or whatever, okay? So substance dualism is really popular amongst people who think that souls are real and people who think that the mind is made of non-physical stuff. And by the way, when I say physical stuff, what I mean is like the sort of stuff that scientists can measure, okay? At least in principle they can measure, all right? You can put it under a microscope, you can run tests with it, all right? It's made of matter. It obeys scientific laws. So those are some characteristics of physical stuff. Okay, non-physical stuff, it depends what it is, but typically it's not bound by physical laws necessarily. It doesn't behave the same way as matter. Okay, what that non-physical stuff is going to depend on your view, but for now we just talk about non-physical stuff and physical stuff. Okay, so that's substance dualism. We're going to look at some really brief objections to each of these views, and then we're going to kind of circle back around and and maybe flesh out a couple of them, and then look at some more detailed objections. Okay. So one objection to substance dualism is there's a really basic question, right? So if you think that the mind is made of stuff that isn't physical, okay, you think it's made of like mental stuff, say, or you think there's a soul and the soul's made of non-physical stuff, okay, there's a question of how it is that non-physical stuff interacts with the physical stuff, right? We have all sorts of cases where physical stuff interacts with physical stuff. That makes sense, right? It obeys various scientific laws. If I were to push a ball into another ball, we can explain the causal chain that's going on there. We can explain why it is the ball hit the other ball and made it move. In part, that's because of conservation of energy. And more generally, the idea is that those sorts of things obey physical laws, and physical laws explain why physical stuff do things. Okay? But our laws don't explain how non-physical stuff interacts with physical stuff. And it would be really puzzling to sort of understand, well, what would it even look like for non-physical stuff to interact with physical stuff? How could it interact with physical stuff, right? Because as far as we know, those two things don't interact, okay? A bigger worry is that it might actually violate some of our scientific laws to think that non-physical stuff interacts with physical stuff. The reason why is typically conservation of energy basically says if you have a certain kind of system, we don't get in really big detail here, but the idea is that in the case of like pushing balls into each other, for instance, the idea is that you're transferring energy that was in the first ball to the other ball that was hit, and that's what explains the movement of the ball. Okay, so anytime there's some sort of physical causation, like if you hit a ball or if you stub your toe or something like that, right? There's a transfer of energy, and the energy also doesn't like vanish into thin air. The energy is conserved, is the idea. Okay. But the problem is that if you think substance dualism is true, then it might actually violate the conservation of energy law. The reason why is because somehow there would have had to have been some kind of causation. For instance, so suppose we think our minds connect up to our body and make our fingers move, okay? Maybe interacts with the brain, whatever. But the idea is there's some sort of causal chain between our mind, which is not a physical thing, and our hands that are moving, okay? Well, for that to work, there needs to be some sort of input of energy, okay? Energy we need to somehow factor into this. But here's the problem. The problem is that somehow it seems like energy is actually being added to the system when it actually shouldn't be if it's just material stuff, because the amount of energy in a system, if we're just talking about material things, is set. You can't just like make energy out of thin air, and it stays sort of within the system you're looking at. But if you're a substance dualist, you need to somehow say, look, if I want these fingers to move and I have a mind and it's a non-physical thing, I somehow need to get energy from this non-physical thing into this physical thing. But then the problem is that now all of a sudden we're creating energy out of nowhere, right? Because if the reverse relationship held, so if my body somehow interacted with my mind, which it seems to do quite often, right? So if I pick my finger, for instance, it seems like my mind responds to the fact that I'm in pain, right? It seems like energy is either getting destroyed in that case, like in other words, like the energy is going to my mind and it just sort of like dissipates out of like nowhere really, or somehow my mind has energy, like the physical sort of stuff we're talking about, and it's somehow getting to my fingers or my hands or whatever. Okay, but then the problem is that if that's the case, that means we're adding energy to a system or completely destroying it. Okay, and that's not possible. So it seems like substance dualism actually violates one of our most fundamental scientific laws. Okay, we'll get to more of that in a little while. Materialism is the view, or sometimes called physicalism, that every object or event in the world is physical or material. Okay. This is quite a popular view, I think, among scientists and probably people who maybe aren't religious. They might think, well, look, what's everything made of? It's made of matter. What's your mind made of? It's made of matter, okay? You might think your mind's just your brain, and we're going to get to that in a little while. Let's table that for now and suppose that your mind is different from your brain, okay? it's strange because nowadays, in the past this wasn't really the case, but nowadays there's a real big push to think your brain is just your mind. But if you rewind the clock back like maybe 20-ish years ago, that wasn't a terribly popular view actually. And in fact, there's many, I mean, if you even go earlier, there's many people who think actually, so it was popular amongst more ancient philosophers, for instance, to think that really where all like the thinking is going on in your mind is actually in your heart. Um, there's all sorts of other organs that people try to pinpoint as being like where your mind is and like what all your mind is. That's a little beside the point. But the idea is that materialism is just the view that everything's made of matter. Okay. Objections to the views are going to depend on the kind of materialism you're looking at. One kind of materialism is called logical behaviorism. Okay. So materialism is like an umbrella term. There's different kinds of theories under that. So logical behaviorism is a materialistic view that says mental states are dispositions to behave in a particular way in certain circumstances. Okay. So what's the mind made of? Well, you might think of it's made of like mental states, right? So think about being in the mental state. Like suppose you're in a mental state of like concentration, okay, or a mental state of like you're trying to remember something. Okay, mental states are just these really general like things that our mind tends to be in when we think. Okay. Not just think also, but feel as well. So we might feel a certain way. That's a mental state as well. Okay. Okay. So your mind, you might think, is just a bunch of mental states. Okay. And if you're a logical behaviorist, this probably sounds right to you. And the idea is like, okay, well, look, it's just a bunch of mental states. And what are mental states? What are the things the mind's made of? Well, all they are just dispositions to behave in a certain way. So when my mind is in a state of pain, for instance, if I'm a logical behaviorist, being in pain is just a disposition to wince when you're hurt, or being sad is just a disposition to cry and shiver. Okay. So all we do if we're logical behaviorists to try to explain what it is the mind is and how that interacts with the body is we're like, look, what we do with our bodies, what we express with our various dispositions, okay, that's all there is really to the mind. Okay. All there is to me being in pain is just saying ow or whatever. All there is to me being in this state of real concentration is for me to, be like, not respond to people talking to me because I'm so concentrated on what I'm reading, for instance. Or maybe if you ask me a question about what I'm reading, I can give you a really detailed answer. So like it seems like I have like a sort of understanding. Okay. But the idea is like you can just look at people's behavior and you can figure out what their mind is basically. Okay. So the mind is just mental states, and mental states just positions to behave in a particular way for logical behaviorism. An objection to that view is called the absent qualia objection, which we're going to look at a little later. But so we'll look at that a little later. But just keep in mind there is a slight problem for this view. Okay, so now we're going to look at a thought experiment. Okay, it's related to these views back here, but I'm not going to say quite how they're connected yet. Okay. So suppose there's this person named Mary, and then she lives her entire life in a room devoid of color. Okay. And she's never directly experienced color in her entire life. Okay, so she's grown up in it, in this room where everything's black and white. She's never seen color before. Okay. The idea is that she's also capable of seeing color, though. Okay, so as of now, she's never seen it, but she can see it. So she reads a bunch of books and she sees a bunch of different kinds of media and stuff like that. And she's educated on neuroscience to the point where she becomes an expert on the subject. Okay, so she knows everything about the workings of the brain is the idea. Okay, suppose we have a really advanced neuroscientific field when Mary's alive. Okay, so she knows everything about the brain. She knows everything about physics. She knows lots about science. Okay. She also learns what it means to perceive color in the brain. So when I see, a blue sky, she knows what's going on in my brain when I see a blue sky. Okay, she knows the corresponding physical stuff going on in my brain when she sees a blue sky. She also knows how light works, right? So she knows how light creates different color wavelengths, how it reflects off things. Okay. So really, Mary knows everything. Suppose Mary knows everything about all the physical facts about color and color perception. Okay. By the way, if you're wondering why the spelling of color is with a U, it's because I think this is actually a nice quotation from the link up top. I think they do a really good job explaining this, so I just pulled it from there. Okay, anyway. So after Mary studies, after her studies on color perception in the brain are complete, she then exits the room that she was in, and she experiences color. She sees red for the first time. Okay. And the idea, here's the idea with this. The idea is like, okay, so far all Mary's experience is just black and white. She knows all the physical facts. She knows how light works. She knows how people perceive things. But does she learn something when she sees the color red for the first time? You might think, well, yeah, maybe she did. But if you say that she did learn something, it must have been the thing that she experienced, the seeing of red. There can't be a physical explanation for that. Because, for instance, if red was just the wavelengths produced by a certain color, right? So of a thing of a certain pigment, okay? So like suppose she looked at an apple. Mary already knows all about, right? We already established Mary knows all about how color works, how the brain sees color. She's read all about it. She knows all the physical facts. She knows a lot of neuroscience, okay? She knows how color works. So if it's just all physical stuff, then when she sees that, she should be like, oh yeah, I already know about this. I read about this, right? But most people don't think that, okay? And if you don't think that, and someone already knows all the physical stuff there is to know, it seems like that experience can't be a physical thing, right? The perception of red, it seems like, isn't just a purely physical thing. It seems like it has to be something else. Because if it wasn't, then surely she didn't learn anything, because she knows all the physical stuff, because she's read it before. The thing that Mary experienced, the seeing of red, the word that people use to describe that kind of experience is qualia, okay? We'll get into what qualia means in a second, but the idea is that there's something to the qualia of seeing red that can't just be explained physical phenomenon. So what's qualia? Well, the idea is that it's a kind of internal feeling or experience to someone. So like, for example, if you were to smell a flower, you smell a rose. Okay, there's something to the experience. There's something to the experience or the internal feeling of when you smell a rose. What it's like to smell a rose. There's like an experience and a feeling to it. And that's like the qualia of smelling a rose. Or when you experience happiness, okay? There's a certain experience and feeling to being happy, okay? And some people have different experiences of these sorts of things, right? When I smell a rose, I might get a little like I might like suppose I like the smell of roses, I might be happier because I smell the rose. But suppose you think they smell awful, well, you might not be happy. And what's interesting is that even though we're doing the same thing, even though we're smelling the same stuff, right? All the same physical stuff seems to be going on. We have different experiences, right? You might think so your friends might have asked you, you know, like, oh, when I see blue, is it the same blue as you? They're kind of asking, like, do we have the same kind of qualia when we look at blue, right? We're asking, do we have the same sort of experience? Okay. So qualia, whether you're a materialist or not, it seems like a real thing. No one typically denies that there's an experience or a feeling to when you see something or you do something or you feel an emotion or whatever. No one typically denies that. The problem with logical behaviorism. So now I'm going back to the problem with the theory we just looked at. It doesn't connect up mental states with this. And in fact, they don't even seem to talk about qualia. So remember, if we're logical behaviorists, all we think is that the mind is really just a set of dispositions to behave in a particular way. But our behaviors don't include what it is to experience or feel something. It's just how we act. And how we act isn't the same thing as what we feel and what we experience. So if we're behaviorists, we can't really account for this weird phenomenon that people experience all the time. Okay, and that seems like a reason to think that behaviorism is false. Okay, so we're going to come back to materialism more generally in a second. A really specific materialist theory. So again, remember, materialism is like an umbrella kind of theory. Identity theory is a kind of materialist theory. This theory says that the mental states are just physical brain states. Okay, if you think that all your mind is just your brain, you're an identity theorist then. The idea is that any time that I feel something or I'm thinking something or what it's like to smell a rose, you can explain all that with physical stuff. And if we say that like your mind is thinking about something or perceiving something, we're really just saying your brain is. Okay. So there isn't any other substance here. It's all physical. Okay. So I think this is a really popular view among scientists, and especially if you're not religious, you might be attracted to this view, especially if you just think your mind is your brain, or if you think you're your brain and you're your mind. Because if you think you're if you think you're your mind, a lot of people think that they are, and you think your mind's your brain, then you think you're your brain, right? And a lot of people are really attracted to that idea. Okay. But this theory has problems. One problem is that it seems like if identity theory is true, then we can know or explain everything about a person's mental states by knowing or explaining everything about the brain. But it isn't possible to know everything about mental states by looking at brain states. So identity theory is false. So what's going on there? How does that work? Well, the idea is like, suppose we'll talk about this when we look at what are sometimes called philosophical zombies in a while. In class, we'll look at philosophical zombies. But suppose you had somebody. So suppose you take yourself, okay, and suppose like I'm not sure if any of you ever seen Star Trek, but suppose so in Star Trek there's this thing where basically there's this machine and it copies the exact location and the kind of like material that your body's made of, and it obliterates your current body. Okay, so imagine you step in this transporter thing, it copies everything, it obliterates your body, and then the machine out of the different planets, say, it it brings back it creates the new matter and stuff and position the exact same way as when you were obliterated. Okay, so it seems like all that's happening is it's like imagine someone took a picture of like the exact position of every physical thing in your body, okay, including the tiniest atom of your brain and everything like that, obliterated it, and then like pasted it on a different planet. Okay. And there's a question of like, well, okay, so if that were the case, suppose that happened to you, is that you on the other planet? You might think, well, no, maybe not, right? At least it's plausible that's not you, right? It doesn't seem like you die and then we're like reincarnated on another planet, okay? But if that's true, then that means, well, look, if all there is to it is just the physical positioning of the stuff in our brain, and we know about that sort of stuff, right? Seems like it should just be you on the planet. But obviously we don't know that, right? If we don't know that, it seems like identity theory is actually false. Okay. A different way of thinking about this is there's a lot of uncertainty in not just the scientific community, but also the philosophical community of what it looks like. Like, what does your brain look like when you're in pain? Like, if to know what it looks like or to understand what it means for you to be in pain, can I just look at your brain and then like understand what it means, what it feels like for you to be in pain? Or like, is all it is to be happy? Like, can I just look at your brain and I'm like, oh, okay, I know exactly what they feel like, right? It doesn't seem like it. No, it seems like maybe no doubt. This objection this argument we're looking at, it's not saying there isn't a connection between our brain and mental states. I don't think anyone denies that. In fact, I think there's probably a pretty big connection between our brain and our mental states. There's a really famous case, for instance, of someone who, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. This is real though. He was a railroad worker, and he got a railroad spike lodged through his eye and his brain in this awful accident. He survived though, and before the accident, I guess he was a pretty nice guy, and then after the accident, all of a sudden his personality changed substantially. Like, he was pretty nasty and mean and stuff, and I don't think it's because he was in pain either. I think it was like just because like even after he like maybe didn't totally recover, but basically like recovered as much as he could. He still was quite a nasty person and seemed like fundamentally different. And you might explain why that was. Well, it's because, well, some part of their brain was damaged that had to do with, their patience, say, like part of the brain that deals with patience or like being like a nice person or whatever. Okay. Um, so no one's denying that. No one denies that there might be a connection between the brain and mental states. But is all there is to being happy just like having your brain like in a certain kind of position, so to speak? Can I just look at your brain and know like, oh, I know you're happy, I know you're sad, I know you're anxious, I know you're stressed or whatever? And it seems like, well, no, there seems to be more to it. Namely, for instance, maybe like there's some of the qualia isn't being explained, right? There's something about the experience that's so different from just the physical stuff going on in your brain. And if that's true, then identity theory can't be right. Okay. Um, there's a sort of combination of the two objections I was brought up. One about you being obliterated and put on another planet, and the other with the fact that you just can't look at someone's brain and know that they're happy. When we look at philosophical zombies, there's sort of like a combination of those two objections going on. It's more so the former than the latter, but it's quite interesting, and we'll take a look at it in class. Okay. The second argument is that if this is against identity theory, by the way, if mental states are identical to brain states, then things without brains can't have mental states. But it seems that they could, so identity theory is false. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, humans have brains. That sounds right. Okay. So humans have brains, and brains are just minds, and minds are just brains. Well, if that's true, then that means nothing without a brain can have a mind. And that seems a little puzzling. Especially, so there's two reasons you might think this is puzzling. One is with aliens who might not have brains, right? If you think that there's intelligent life, you might think that, well, if they're intelligent life, they need to be some sort of mental creature. They need to have mental states. They need to be able to think. Okay. The other thing is that they might not have brains like we do, right? They might have something else. And if that's the case, then it seems like, well, then minds just aren't brains, right? Because aliens potentially could have minds without having brains. More interestingly, I think, and one that's like a real hot topic nowadays, I think, is whether artificial intelligence can be thought to have a mind, really. A lot of people think that they can, but AI definitely does not have a brain in a literal sense. It doesn't have like a thing like a biological thing like we do. Sometimes we talk, you know, as in figure of speech that computers might have brains, but they don't literally have brains like we do. They don't have things that run off of blood and meat. Okay, but if you think that AI can have a brain or can have a mind, excuse me, then brains that can't be identical to minds. We'll get back to the AI point in a second. Okay, but there's an assumption going on here, and I think it's worth considering. It's called the assumption behind this argument is called multiple realizability, and the idea is that multiple realizability is the capacity for something to be realized or instantiated in a variety of forms or materials. So let's step away from the mind-body stuff for a second. Let's talk about stories. Okay, stories. Right. So think about the story of so think about Robin Hood. Robin Hood's a story, okay? But there's all sorts of forms and ways Robin Hood has been told. It's been told orally, right? People like tell the story of Robin Hood like literally through voice. Some people have made movies about Robin Hood. Some people have written movies about Robin Hood. Some people have acted movies about Robin Hood. Some people have made songs about him. Okay, there's all sorts of different ways that the same story, the story about Robin Hood, is told. Okay, this goes for all sorts of stories, right? There's different ways to tell the same story. Okay, that's kind of what's going on here with having a mind. The idea is like the mind can be realized or instantiated in a variety of forms or materials. So, the idea is like, look, if there's aliens, maybe they don't have brains, but maybe they have something else that's physical. It's not a brain though, maybe something else that's physical, and that's like what their mind is. Or maybe for AI, they have a mind, and they're still made of physical stuff in a way, but it's not a brain, right? It's some sort of weird combination of all the pieces in the computer, for instance, or maybe like the motherboard or something like that. Okay, good. So now we're gonna move on to functionalism. Functionalism is the view that the mind is just the functions that the brain performs. Okay, this isn't actually a materialist view. It actually does. It's kind of neutral. It's not saying that everything is made of matter if you're a functionalist. It's also not making a claim of whether anything is made of non-physical stuff. It's kind of neutral. Typically, when people talk about this sort of stuff, they're materialists, but you don't have to be a materialist to be a functionalist. Okay. Anyway, so what's the idea behind this? Well, here's the idea basically. Okay, so suppose I see an apple. Okay, I perceive an apple. It's a kind of stimuli. Okay, seeing the red interacts with my mental states. Namely, what it does is it makes it so that I can perceive, like I can have an experience, right? There's a quality to seeing a red apple. Okay, so there's this light and it hits my eyes, and then it somehow interacts with my mind, and then I like actually see the apple, and then I might have a behavior. Right? I might pick it up. I might smile because I like red apples. Okay, but there's like a causal chain of stuff going on. Okay, and all the mind are just like the inputs and outputs. Okay, of you, right? So the input here is like the stimuli. Okay, so I get like a stimuli input, and then I output a behavior. Okay, I'm just like a computer in a way, and that's all my mind is. My mind is just the functions that my brain performs. Okay, it's kind of weird because in a way it's not quite behavioralist. It's not like logical behaviorism. It's not just like focusing on behavior, because that would just be like an output thing, right? It would just be focusing on outputs. But this also focuses on inputs, right? So the idea is that to explain what the mind is, you need to also explain how it is that stimuli interacts with mental states, okay? And that interaction, that thing right there, this big thing right here between the stimuli and the mental states, that's what my mind is right there, okay? It also includes this bigger thing too, right? So the mind has a lot going on for it, right? There's all sorts of like inputs and outputs, and it's all your mind is, okay? It's a processor kind of. Okay. Back to computers. So the idea, so if you think that if you're a functionalist and you think the mind is the functions that the brain performs, okay, you're probably attracted to the view that maybe computers have minds, and the view that computers have minds is called strong AI, strong artificial intelligence. So the idea is that people who believe in strong AI think that artificial intelligence actually has minds. It can make decisions, right? It kind of intelligence like us, as mental states. The opposing view is way broader, but it's called weak AI, and the idea is that at the bare minimum, computers are just simulating minds. At best, they're simulating minds. Okay, much modern AI, like the stuff that we see, like, right. So anything that you've ever interacted with that involves AI, it's definitely of the weak sort of sense, right? Your Amazon Echo isn't actually thinking anything, okay? In a really simple sense, so I actually used to be pretty involved with computers, and at least when I was doing stuff with computers, the way AI worked, at least for lots of the sort of stuff that people interacted with, it was really sort of like I could write down a piece of paper how it is the computer makes decisions for you, right? It was not very complicated, right? It's like if the user did this thing, then you should do this thing, and then if they do this thing, then you should do this thing. It was just a bunch of like conditional sort of stuff, right? But our minds don't work like that. Our minds are a lot more complex than that. It seems, at least. Okay, all right. You can't boil down my mind to like a page of like conditionals, okay, like how some AI has been programmed, okay. Anyway, so much of the AI nowadays, I think a lot of people would think it's like a weak kind of AI, but the question is not what most AI is like. It's like, could it be possible? Is it possible that computers can actually have minds to begin with. If it is possible, then you probably think strong AI is true. If you don't think it's possible, then you probably buy into weak AI. Okay. Okay, so if you're a functionalist, this might seem really attractive because the nice thing about it is that, well, suppose you're like, oh, I'm not really sure whether materialism's true or not. Well, you don't need to pick a side. Functionalism is neutral about it. Okay. And not just that, but it also seems to avoid, let me go back here. It avoids the question of how is something non-physical interact with the physical. If you just want to be a materialist, you can avoid it. You avoid all the problems of the identity theory. So it allows aliens to have mental states because it's just a bunch of functions. Okay. It also explains why it is just because we know everything about someone's brain means that just because we know everything about someone's brain doesn't mean that we know what's going on in their mind. Well, how do we explain that? Well, because your brain isn't your mind, right? Your mind is just functions that the brain performs. Again, there's a tight connection between the two, but they're slightly different. Okay. But it runs into a similar problem as logical behaviorism. So it's like a step up, you might think, for logical behaviorism. It's a bit more complex, but nonetheless, it still runs into a similar problem. And it's just back to this absent quality objection. So the idea is like, look, you can have all sorts of functional states, right? You can have a computer, right? Who's like, so when you click something on a computer, right, you're giving the computer an input and it spits out an output, right? It might show you like a window that pops up or something like that. Okay. That doesn't mean the computer has like an experience of what it is to be clicked. Okay. That can be true for you too, right? So if functionalism is true, then that must mean that like, well, all there is to it is just inputs and outputs. But then that means that we have no explanation of this whole qualia stuff again. We're back to qualia. But if you can have functional states without qualia, right? So if we can just explain everything about the mind without qualia, but qualia seems to be a real thing, then we shouldn't think functionalism is true because there's no room for qualia in functionalism. Okay. But here's a further issue, right? So go back to the Mary's room stuff we just talked about. The problem is that if the Mary's room thought experiment, if you think that's compelling to think that she learned something, you also can't think materialism's true, okay? Because again, it seems like if she knew all the physical stuff, then she should know what it's like to see red, okay? So functionalism's not true if we think this absent quality objection is good. Materialism can't be true. Logical behaviorism can't be true. So where are we back to? Well, we're back to dualism again, right? We're just back to saying that, okay, maybe there's like this non-physical stuff again. Okay. But you don't have to be a substance dualist. So you might worry that like you don't like substance dualism. Maybe you're like, oh, maybe I don't know about this soul thing. I'm not sure about how things interact. Okay. You don't have to be a substance dualist though. You can be what's called a property dualist. Property dualists or property dualism is the idea that mental properties are non-physical properties arising from, but not reducible to physical properties. So for example, I might see red, and there's physical processes such that it makes me see red, but it isn't equivalent to those processes. Okay, so let me give an analogy here to sort of explain what's going on, because I think this one's kind of tricky to understand. So you might think like, okay, mental properties. I kind of get what those are, right? So maybe you think, okay, mental properties, what's that? Well, so maybe like knowing something is a mental property. Being in pain is a mental property. Being happy is a mental property. And those are somehow mental, as in they're non-physical properties arising from, but not reducible to physical stuff. Physical properties, excuse me. Okay. So what's this mean? Arising from, but not reducible to? Well, let's think about a diamond, okay? Diamonds are made up of carbon, okay? So carbon on the atomic level has various physical properties. There's a certain weight, okay, I'm not quite sure what the atomic weight of carbon is, but it's quite small. The size of it's quite small as well, not just the weight, but also the size is quite small. You can also combine carbon with other atoms to make different sorts of molecules. Okay, it's hard to see under a microscope. Okay, so carbon has these properties. But diamonds, on the other hand, they weigh more than any individual carbon atom. They also can't combine with other elements, right? And what I mean by that is like, so CO2 is carbon and 2 oxygen, but you can't like put a diamond and 2 oxygen atoms together and make something out of it, right? That's not how this stuff works, okay? So anyway, diamonds weigh more than any individual atom. Excuse me. They can't come out with other atoms. But diamonds can also, they're really good at cutting things, right? Some saws are made of diamonds, and they can cut through like really, really tough stuff. And diamonds are also shiny, okay? But so here's how to think of it though, right? Diamonds arise from a combination of carbon atoms. But diamonds don't have the same properties as those atoms, right? Diamonds aren't incredibly small. They don't have the atomic weight that carbon atoms have, okay? And carbon can't cut stuff, right? Like a carbon atom couldn't cut anything, right? A single carbon atom isn't shiny, okay? But diamonds are shiny. Diamonds can cut things, okay? And so the idea is like diamonds arise from, they get these properties. Diamonds get physical properties, like having the ability to cut things, being shiny. They get physical properties from these smaller things that don't have those properties, the carbon atoms, okay? So diamonds arise from a combination of carbon atoms, okay? How does this relate to what I just talked about? Well, keep the diamond analogy in the back of your head, okay? Mental properties just arise from physical properties, just like diamonds. The properties of diamonds arise from from atoms and the properties of atoms, right? But they're not reducible to those properties, right? You can't say, oh, all it is for something to be shiny is just for it to be, well, I'm not even sure what the corresponding property of the carbon atom would be, because carbon atoms aren't shiny, right? You don't just have a bunch of little tiny shiny things and you combine them all together and it makes a big shiny thing, right? Diamonds are shiny, carbon atoms aren't shiny, okay? So you can't reduce the shininess of a diamond or the ability for diamonds to cut, the property of being a thing that can cut things well, to carbon atoms, right? Because carbon atoms can't cut things well. Carbon atoms can't cut anything, okay? At least on like a macro level, right? And so that's what's going on here, right? The idea is like you have physical stuff, okay? You have physical properties, right? So you have the property of, so let's take our brains for instance, right? It has a physical property of, circulating blood and being of such and such a density and weighing so much, okay, and whatever. All right, there's all sorts of things we need to talk about with our brain, the properties of the brain, okay. But those properties, right, they aren't the same things as those mental properties, right? The distinction here is that from these properties, a bigger thing arises, just like with the carbon atoms and diamonds. A bigger thing arises, and what those things are mental properties. And those mental properties, for instance, being in pain, being happy, it's not reducible to the physical stuff going on in the brain. Just like the properties of a diamond are not reducible to the stuff of the properties of a carbon atom. Okay, and that's the idea. So the idea is that unlike, it's not, so notice there's a distinction though. There's a pretty big distinction. It's not saying that physical properties arise like an entirely different, it's not like your soul or anything here, right? These are properties, right? There's still a property, right, of a physical thing, right? It's like a part of a physical thing in a way, but it's not, but the properties themselves aren't physical. And the physical thing on its own does not explain these mental properties, okay? The mental properties come about from a combination of the physical stuff, okay? So that's what it means for mental properties to arise from physical properties and not be reducible to them, okay? But it runs into a similar problem as substance dualism. So the problem is that even for property dualism, you need to somehow explain how it is that mental properties could ever cause any changes in the physical world, okay? So the idea is like, look, so our minds have various sorts of mental properties, but how could those mental things, so just it's just going back to the substance dualism stuff, how is it those mental things can interact with the physical stuff out there? How is it that these mental properties somehow interact with my hand, for instance, when I raise my hand? How does it do that? Um, it seems like it shouldn't be able to, especially given our current understanding of scientific laws and the conservation of energy. So how does it do it then? Um, Cartesian immaterial substance, that's we'll get to that in class, but if you're a substance dualist, not a property dualist, but a substance dualist, and you think the mind is a totally different thing than the body, then you might think it's a soul, for instance, but it has the same sort of problem, right? So we already talked about this and how it seems like, how could it be possible for an immaterial substance to interact with a physical thing? Okay. This view that mental properties do not cause anything but merely accompany physical properties is called epiphenomenalism. So if you think that, if you look at this problem and you're like, oh, I'm actually not sure how to answer this question, and maybe it just they don't interact, then you'd be what's called an epiphenomenalist. Okay. That doesn't mean you're out of the objection. It doesn't mean you solve the objection just by putting a label on yourself. But the idea is you need to somehow, you would think, okay, maybe mental properties actually don't cause anything in the physical world, but they're there in some way. And if you think that might be fine, but you'd somehow need to explain why it is that this is like an okay position to have when it seems like mental properties cause stuff all the time, right? It seems like just by raising my hand, that sort of disproves epiphenomenalism. But we'll look at some theories that try to defend this view. Okay. So that's all I have to say about this. So we'll talk about all these theories again in class, and we'll do some readings. And again, if you haven't looked at the reading already, please go ahead and do so. All right. And that's all I have. So I'll see you all on Wednesday.